Hi, this is Social and Political Philosophy. I'm Mark Thorsby. This video I want to give you an introduction to some of the basic concepts and some of the critical questions in social and political philosophy. The lecture for today's talk is called Politics as Unfreedom. What exactly is political and social philosophy? And there's really a constellation of three questions I want to look at today. And the first question is, what is philosophy? The second is, what is political philosophy, and how is political philosophy different from sort of other forms of philosophy or philosophical reflection? And finally, what is social philosophy? Now, that means, of course, we're going to look at the question of what is philosophy, what is politics, and finally, what exactly is society? And that's what we're going to be taking a look at today in today's video. So, welcome aboard, and I hope you enjoy the video. Let me move here, and let me close this out. Okay, so let's go ahead and start here with the title for today's talk, of course, is Politics is Unfreedom. And what I want to do here is look at these three different questions. The first question is, what exactly is philosophy? What is philosophy? Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger for you as well. So let's see here. Okay, what is philosophy? Well, let me start here by giving sort of a basic introduction of sort of the history of philosophy a little bit. I know that many of you who are watching this have probably taken philosophy courses, and if you have, much of what I'm about to say in this video is probably just going to be a review for you. But let's go ahead and start with this question, what is philosophy? And what I want to do in order to begin to engage in understanding and diagnosing what this question is, I want to start off by looking at the etymology of the word. Now, what is etymology? Etymology is the study of the history of a word history, right? That is how the different words are built, right? So, for instance, if you've ever taken the SAT, or, well, I guess you probably haven't taken the GRE, but if you've ever taken one of these big tests, you're often told to do a sort of etymology for words you don't know. So let's take a look at this. So philosophy is really composed of two different roots in the word. The first one is philo here, which in Greek literally means love. Something like brotherly love, right? Many of you have probably heard of that. Think of Philadelphia as the city of brotherly love, right? That's the city of love. So philo here refers to love. And what is Sophie or Sophia referred to? It refers to the notion of wisdom. So the original history of the word was the idea that philosophy is the love of wisdom, right? Now that doesn't specify exactly what we mean by what we think philosophy is today, especially given the fact that today philosophy has become extremely professionalized and very technical. But let's keep going with this. So, and some of you may be thinking, okay, well, if philosophy is the love of wisdom, well, Mark, what is wisdom exactly? I don't know what wisdom is. So here the question is, well, what is wisdom? And here I would encourage you maybe even to pause the video and just stop and reflect and ask the question for yourself, what exactly do you think wisdom means? Or what is wisdom? And you can think here about when we go to speak to a wise person, what are we doing here exactly? Think about a person in your life who maybe you think is wise. Well, here's my idea. When I think of a wise person, I think someone who is wise is someone who, well, in a very typical sense, really just knows what to do, right? They know they know what to do, right? Knowing what to do. Here I'm going to erase that S, right? Something like knowing what to do. And that means here that means that wisdom can be broken down further into maybe two different components. The first here would be the question of knowledge. And on the other hand, we have, I think, the question of action, right? Now, knowledge here. Knowledge. And when I talk about knowledge here, we need to be very clear in demarcating our conception of knowledge from that of an opinion, right? An opinion is someone's perspective about what they believe is the case in the world. Whereas by contrast, knowledge is supposed to encapsulate what actually is the case in the world. And knowledge is not a belief, right? So for instance, many people say that they know God exists. Strictly speaking, barring sort of, I guess, religious experience, a supernatural experience or something, people don't know that God exists. They believe that God exists. They have an opinion of that. And that opinion may be true or false. By contrast, knowledge, if it really is knowledge, should be true, right? So knowledge, if it really is knowledge, is always going to be true. You can't have false knowledge. Otherwise, it's not knowledge. In fact, this problem it goes back to an ancient discussion that comes out of Plato. Okay, so here's what we can say here is that I think knowledge in contemporary philosophy gets divided into really two different categories. On the one hand is the discussion of epistemology, and on the other hand is the question of metaphysics. And we're going to see the action, I think, refers to the domain of ethics. Okay? And in fact, we could say that epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics form the three core components of philosophy in total. Right? So let's sort of go this. What is epistemology? Well, like I said before, epistemology and metaphysics somehow relate to knowledge. Epistemology is the study or theory of knowledge itself. It's the answer, it's the study of how we come to know. How is it that I can come to know that something is or is not the case, right? Let's take an example here, something that we all, at the time of recording this video, Barack Obama is the president of the United States, and I know that. So the question would be, how did I come to know that? Well, I came to know that through my experience of the world, right? Number one, I went to the voting booth, and he was a candidate on there, and I watched the news that night, and he won the election, and every day on the news I'm experiencing these references to Obama, to President Obama. So there's many different sorts of theories of knowledge, and again, epistemology, the formal sort of explanation would be epistemology is the study and theory of knowledge, right? What are some of the basic types of epistemologies? Well, on the one hand, the basic one we have here is what's known as empiricism. Empiricism. Empiricism would be the idea that knowledge comes from experience, right? And usually here we mean sensory experience, right? Not mental experience, but sensory experience. I literally experienced things, and then those experiences have been translated into ideas in my mind, and that's what knowledge is, right? And then I verify those. So in the contemporary world, science is essentially an empirical investigation, right, into determining the way the world is, right? Think here about, for instance, when you hear on the news that about the Hadron Collider in Europe, right? They're spinning atoms at high velocities, crashing them together. And why are they doing this? So they can gain experimental data, right, that they can experience, and they experience it through the tools and techniques and mechanisms they've developed. And then they use that experience to adjust their theory about the way the world works, whether or not there's the boson-Higgs particle and so on and so forth, right? But by contrast here, there's other forms or other theories of knowledge. Famously, another type of epistemology would be known as rationalism. Rationalism. And rationalism is the idea that some things can only be known through reason, not experience, right? So think here about mathematics, right? Someone comes to gain knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem not through experience, but through reason, right? And this is why I think about when you took a math class, if you had difficulty with the math class, part of the reason you may have had difficulty was because to understand the concept requires a rational operation of the mind. You can't just see how numbers get added together. You have to reason it out, right? So rationalism is the idea that some things have to just be reasoned out. And you can think here about, for instance, well, I have to be a little bit careful here, but I was thinking, for instance, about theoretical physics or something. But rationalism is the idea that some things can only be known through reason. Plato is a famous rationalist, though he didn't conceive of himself in those terms. Sometimes he's referred to as rationalist. David Hume's a famous empiricist by contrast. There's many other theories of knowledge. I'll only give you one more here, which we'll probably be referring to, and that's the notion of skepticism. Skepticism isn't really a theory of knowledge so much as it is a denial of knowledge, right? The skeptic argues that you cannot know that something is the case. Now, there's different forms of skeptics. There's radical skeptics who argue you can't have knowledge at all. Most people are not of that sort. Most skeptics are sort of mitigated skeptics. They think some things cannot be known while other things can be, right? David Hume's a good example of sort of mitigated empirical skeptic. But skepticism would be the denial or questioning of knowledge, okay? And so those are three sort of basic positions in epistemology, though there are many, many others. Okay, let's look here at metaphysics. Let's ask the question, well, if epistemology is the study of how we know, metaphysics is the analysis of what exactly reality is. So you might even say that metaphysics is the study of reality, right? Meta, doing the etymology, meta means beyond, and physics, of course, means the physical world. So metaphysics sort of relates to the idea of that which is beyond the physical, which forms the basis of the physical. You might say metaphysics studies the substrate of reality. I want to give you a very different sort of, more precise, I think, definition for metaphysics, and it would be this. Metaphysics is the study of that which must necessarily be the case, such that the world is as it is. Let me see if I can type this out for us here, because I think it may be helpful, right? So let's say this. Metaphysics is the study of that which must necessarily be the case, such that the world is as it is, right? So metaphysics is the study of that which must necessarily be the case, such that the world is as it is. That is, metaphysics seeks to discover those necessary conditions that must be foundational to our experience of the world, right? So think, for instance, about atoms, right? In fact, atomic theory, today we have modern atomic theory, which you probably were taught in elementary school or high school, and you've probably taken classes on physics, particle physics maybe perhaps, right? There's different thing about the periodic table of elements and so on and so forth, which is based on our theory of atomic physics. Now, the theory of atoms actually goes all the way back to ancient Greece, and it was originally metaphysical, not a physical theory. And the idea was here, how is it, think about our bodies, think about my hand, my body, right? Think about the fact that when I eat an apple, somehow the apple literally turns into me, right? It literally goes from being its own body, embodied existing being, if you will, lowercase b, right? And somehow when I eat it, it goes into me, it's broken down, and it literally begins to form my own body, right? Now, in this problem of change here, the ancient philosophers known as the pre-Socratics sort of bumped up against this problem and thought, wait a second, how is that possible? How is it that something that's not me can become me? Or, right? How is that the case? And so they argued that must mean that the apple is somehow made up of the same things as I am. Maybe they're just infinitesimally small. And in fact, they called them atoms. And atom, A-T-O-M, in Greek meant no cut. It meant indivisible. And the idea was, well, maybe my body is made up of all of these, is a certain sort of configuration of these tiny little things that can't be broken down any further. And so is the apple. And so when I eat an apple, what happens is, it's not that anything goes out of existence, because that wouldn't make any sense. How could things go in and out of existence? It must be that those atoms get broken up into little bits, and they get recombined or reformulated into my body, right? And so that's an example of a metaphysical theory where I'm trying to figure out, I'm studying what has to be the case, what's necessary, such that the world is as it is, such that, for instance, we're able to actually, beings change from one to another, right? So that's sort of what metaphysics studies. And there's multiple metaphysical theories, and I definitely will not go all of them. I mean, I encourage you to take an actual philosophy course if you're going to do metaphysics. But I'll give you a couple positions here. One metaphysical system here is known as monism. Uh-oh, I wonder where all my things went. Monism. And monism is the idea that all of reality is fundamentally one thing, right? That's what reality is. It's monistic. And that seems sort of odd when you first think about it, but you can also ask the question, well, how is it that, can there really be difference in the world? And think about the problem of space. In between myself and the cup, right, between my hand and the cup is empty space, but wait a second, if it's empty space, then shouldn't my hand be touching or be in connection with the cup, right? This is sort of a version of one of Zeno's paradoxes. But the idea here is that, wait a second, that must mean that maybe there is no actual space between the cup and my hand. And furthermore, and here we're making lots of leaps for sure, maybe all of reality, my hand, whatever's in between my hand and the cup itself are actually all the same thing, right? To say that they're real means that they somehow participate in the same form of existence. And so monism is a sort of classical position that says that all of reality is fundamentally one, right? And now by contrast here, there's another theory here, which is known as dualism. What is going on? By the way, I apologize for my handwriting. It's sort of difficult writing on this computer. Dualism. Well, why have one when you can have two, right? And dualism is the idea that reality may be made up of two things. Now, most of you watching this video probably are dualist, right? For instance, if you believe there's a heaven, there's earth, and then there's the heavenly realm where God lives or whatever, right? That means you're a dualist, right? Because you think reality is bifurcated into two different domains, right? Another form of, so there's Christian dualism, right? If you're a Christian or if you're a Muslim, then you're probably a dualist. Another form of dualism comes out of Plato's theory, and we'll be looking at this next week with the Republic. And that theory is the idea that there's two basic forms of reality, being and becoming, right? Or in Descartes, you have a dualism that says there's mind and body, right? There's the mental and there's the physical. That's another form of dualism. Okay, so there's dualism. Another example here would be the idea of materialism. I don't know what's going on here. Whoop, then something comes back. Materialism would be the idea that, no, reality is just material stuff, right? It's just physical stuff. Now the question though is what exactly is material? Now you can see here that atomism would be something of a form of materialism, right? Most people today are probably either dualist or materialist, right? As reality is just material stuff, okay? Now, here another final one here I'll give you, and there's as many metaphysical theories as there are philosophers, would be idealism. Idealism is the sort of opposite, it's the other side of the coin from materialism. Idealism, or at least its most basic form, would be the idea that reality is made up of just ideas. It's not made up of matter at all. And here you can think about the fact that how do you know that there's really matter or physical stuff in the world? The answer is you don't really know, right? Because all you have access to, think about your experience. What exactly are you experiencing while you're watching this video? You may think that you're experiencing a TV screen or a computer monitor or an iPad or something, but wait a second. Are you actually directly experiencing a computer screen? No. What you're actually experiencing is a mental image of the light waves that are coming from the computer screen into your eyes. So But that means that all of your senses are always just ideas in the mind. But if they're ideas in the mind, how do you know that there's a physical reality for those ideas outside of yourself when every thought you think is already in the mind? And the answer becomes, you don't know. So maybe reality is just a substrate of ideas. Maybe the mental is what's real, not the physical, right? And you can take a look at like the sort of idealism I'm describing here would go well with the philosopher by the name of George Berkeley. But the only idealist we'll be looking at in this course, who's I think much more sophisticated form of idealism, would be that of Hegel. And we'll be looking at his philosophy, his social philosophy, his idealistic social philosophy later in the term. Okay, and there's other forms of metaphysics. I don't want to belabor the point here. And finally, let's take a look at ethics, right? And there's a lot of different, if epistemology studied how, metaphysics is the study of what knowledge is, ethics is the study of action, right? How we ought to act, right? How we ought to live in the world, right? If it's how, it's what. Ethics is the study of ought. What ought I to do, right? And there's different forms of ethics, and I'm just going to give you a couple here, and then we'll sort of go into political social philosophy in its particularity. The first one here would be what we would talk about as hedonism. Hedonism would be a pleasure-centered ethics, right? That would be the idea that how should I live my life? Well, you ought to live the most pleasurable form of life, right? And there's sort of the vulgar hedonism and what I would call a sophisticated form of hedonism that comes out of the work of Epicurus, right? Vulgar hedonism is the sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll position, right? Is that if it feels good, do it, right? Whereas Epicurean hedonism would be the idea of, well, you should pursue pleasure, but guess what? Some pleasures cause pain. So you should only pursue those pleasures which have the least amount of pain associated with them. Let me give you an example here. Whereas the start of the fall term as I'm recording this video, and so we've just finished out the summer. And what do a lot of college students love to do over the summer? Well, they love to party, right? And think about if you go to a nightclub on a Saturday night, like 11 o'clock, everyone, or not everyone, but most people in the club are having lots of fun, right? They're having pleasure, right? But fast forward 12 hours later, where are a lot of those people going to be? A lot of them are probably going to be sick because they got drunk and then they're getting a hangover later, right? So that means that the pleasure of drinking at the nightclub and partying, right, can result in pain that's later. In fact, the pain of getting a hangover usually lasts a lot longer than the pleasure that the drinking itself gave, right? So Epicurus would say, given that dynamic, the fact that this pleasure causes this pain, to live the most pleasurable life means, well, guess what? You shouldn't limit or cut out that pleasure. You should pursue those pleasures which have the least amount of pain, right? That would be sort of hedonism. Another form of ethics here would be known as egoism. And egoism would be the idea that I ought to pursue my self-interest, right? So if it's in my interest, I ought to do it. If it's not in my interest, I should not do it, right? For instance, I think many people who reflect on capitalism tend to be egoist, right? And in fact, in social political philosophy, we're going to see that many of the social political philosophers, in fact, I would say the overwhelming majority in the early modern period, were all egoists, right? For them, right, everyone wants what they want to do, and the question of politics is, how can we organize people's pursuit of their own self-interest in a way that's conducive to the greater good, if you will, right? So egoism is the pursuit of self-interest, and that's ethical egoism. Another theory here, which is known as utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is the idea that you ought to pursue the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. Now, how do you find happiness? Well, you can define happiness in terms of pleasure, or you can define happiness in terms of preference, or there's a number of different ways in which you can begin to conceptualize what happiness is. But again, for the utilitarian, happiness is the pursuit of the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. Right? I'm sorry. Utilitarianism is the pursuit of the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. That is, all of our actions are utilities. Right? They're utilities. They're things we use. Think about what a utility is when you pay your utility bill. You're paying for what you use. For the utilitarian, our actions, our actions are simply tools we use to build up the greatest amount of happiness. Not for myself, but for you too, for the society itself. In fact, utilitarianism is a form of social ethics, right? Okay, let's keep going here. The last theory well, maybe there's two more theories I'll give you here, is deontology. And deontology, which comes primarily from the work of a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, who wrote a lot on political social philosophy. Deontology is what we would call duty-based ethics. It's the idea that you have certain moral duties and you ought to fulfill those moral duties regardless of the pleasure, regardless of your self-interest, or even regardless of the happiness that comes out in the final end, right, in the utilitarian sense. Right? You have moral duties. Think, for instance, I have a moral duty not to kill another person, right? Which means that I can't just arbitrarily kill other people, even if we're all going to be happier if I do kill that person, right? You get what I mean? The utilitarian would say, well, what's the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people? If killing someone in a war, for instance, is going to do that, for instance, think about the firebombing of Tokyo during World War II, killing thousands of innocent people, right? Was the U.S. justified? Well, the U.S. dropped those bombs for utilitarian purposes. They thought they could hasten the end of the war, so some people die, but the overwhelming majority of people will actually live a better life despite the atrocity, right? Whereas the deontologist would say, no, you have a moral duty to another person. You can never arbitrarily kill another person, regardless of the reason. And so this would be a duty-based ethics, or a deontology. The last form of ethics I'll mention here is what we call virtue ethics. And this is the ethics we're going to start with, really. Well, we're looking at political social philosophy, but the virtue ethics originates from Plato and Aristotle. And this is the idea that how we ought to live is really the question of not so much what I ought to do, but how I ought to be. That is, what sort of person should I become? That is, I should become a virtuous person. And the idea here was that if you cultivate virtue, you ultimately cultivate a good life, right? So these are the three basic sort of domains of philosophy. Now, where does political philosophy come in? Political philosophy, Aristotle, since we're sort of ending with virtue ethics, but it really comes on this side of the equation, right? Whereas ethics is very individualistic, the way I've been describing it here, right? How I ought to act. You might say that political philosophy is the question of how we ought to arrange the social and political situation so as to live the best sorts of life, so as to be conducive to the most amount of happiness, or so to create a general good for everyone to share, a social good of some sort. Okay? So let me go down here, and I'm actually going to begin now to answer that. That's sort of my answer to the question, what is philosophy? Or at least to give you a basic intro here. Let's see here. Let me scroll down here. Good Lord, what is all this? Okay. Now let's go through sort of what is some of the more basics of philosophy. Now there's other domains in philosophy, including aesthetics, which is the study of beauty, or logic, which is the study of reasoning, or whatnot. Political philosophy is essentially, let's write this down. Political philosophy, right? Political philosophy is the study of the nature and justification of coercive institutions. Right? Political philosophy is the study of the nature and justification of coercive institutions. Now, what do I mean by coercive institutions? A coercive institution institution that forces members to do certain things, right? They coerce their members to act in certain ways. Now, you remember at the beginning of my talk, I labeled this that that politics is unfreedom, right? And here's the idea that when we live in a political framework, we give up a certain degree of our freedom to the political institution, right? So, for instance, in the case, and there's many different political institutions within a society, right? In our own society, the United States, we have a federal government, right? We have state government. We even have bureaucratic institutions which have political power, right? Think about the EPA. And when I mean political power, I mean they have coercive power, right? The EPA can regulate, for instance, greenhouse emissions, or at least they're trying to, right? But it can regulate certain pollutants and coercively. But we can also talk about the state level. We might even say, or the township level, the village. In fact, we might even say that the first political institution at all is the family, right? And you normally wouldn't think about that, but think about it. In a family, what do parents do, right? They coerce their children to behave in certain ways, right? And it's institutionalized, right? Think about, for instance, marriage. We've had a lot of debate in this country about gay marriage recently, right? But marriage we refer to as an institution, right? That's because the family is an institution, right? So political philosophy has all of these different domains. Now, the classic sort of political philosophers, right? The classic political philosophers, they were principally concerned with studying the nature and justification of the polis. And the polis for them was a city-state, right, in ancient Greece. For Plato and Aristotle, Athens was a city-state. They didn't have nations. They just had cities, right? In fact, in ancient Greece, each polis or the poli, that's the multiples, right, had different constitutions, different forms of government, and they had different reasons for doing it, right? So we're going to see Plato and Aristotle are really interested in figuring out what justifies the coercive institution of the polis, right? Democracy, for instance. Right, and you will see that they actually have a very sort of critical view of democracy. One of the things you're going to discover in this course is that everything is up for debate, in the sense that we're not here simply, even though we're going to be talking a lot about social democratic systems, we're not going to begin with the assumption that democracy is the best form of government. Rather, we'll come to the conclusion, perhaps, that it is maybe one of the most practically justified forms of government. But I don't know about best. But we'll talk about that as we go through here, right? Now, we'll see that modern political theories, for them, the institution they're concerned with is really what we would call the nation state, right? The nation state, right? And in fact, modern political theory, well, the first modern political theorist we're going to look at is Machiavelli from Italy, who's Italian. But we're going to see that really the main guy who really gets it going is Thomas Hobbes, and after him, John Locke. These two thinkers are really sort of the cornerstones of modern political theory, and then for them, the question was, how do we justify the coerciveness of the nation state? And for when they lived, it was a monarchy, but you can see that especially John Locke, for instance, lays the groundwork to create sort of representative democracy, the form of government we actually have today in the United States, right? But that's the sort of forms of institutions that most of the thinkers are concerned with, though we'll see that, for instance, philosophers like Hegel or Marx, they are interested in other forms of institution, including, right, the family, right, the village, and so on and so forth. We might even say economic institutions as well, okay? And then we'll sort of come to this at the end here, right? So we might say, so again, political philosophy is the study of the nature of justification of coercive institutions. And the coercion part here is really important because ultimately, think about it like this. I live in the United States, and in the United States, I have certain rights and duties. Now, I have, for instance, the right to free speech. But you can see here that right is predicated on the coerciveness of the institution to constrain my freedom in other forms, right? I don't have the freedom to drive a car without a license, right? I don't have the freedom to take my neighbor's property, right? I don't have the freedom to use other people as slaves, right? That's because the institution has taken away those natural freedoms. And when I say natural freedom, I just mean those natural capabilities and said, listen, we're going to outlaw those so that we can grant you other forms of freedom, right? And this later on will get referred to as the problem of alienation. Now, what I want to do here is, because we're already on 35 minutes here, let me scroll down here. What I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about, make a couple general distinctions here. Let me see here if I can, let me just make a new screen here. Okay, I'm going to type this out because I think it's a little bit easier to read. Okay, just put down a couple definitions here. Let's see here. Let's start with liberalism, right? Because one of the things that you're going to hear me refer, and I've already referred to it quite a bit already, talk about liberalism. But what I don't mean is liberal versus conservative, the way we would see on like Fox News or something like that, right? In contemporary America, we think of liberals as, Democrats, and we think of conservatives as Republicans and this sort of thing. Well, in political philosophy, liberalism here is the idea that we ought, or what we're going to refer to as classical liberalism, is the idea that we should constrain liberty. The constraints of liberty should be conceived of as a positive fact, right? Constraints of liberty are a positive act, right? Oops, I misspelled that. Right. Liberalism, the constraints of liberty are a positive act. And in the classical sense of liberalism, Republicans today and Democrats today are both liberals, because they both think that we should constrain liberty in a variety of ways, and that that's positive and conducive to creating a better world, right? So for instance, think about, not only am I in our country as a classical liberal country, right? I'm constrained from killing people and stealing people's property. There are things I can't do, but my liberty is also constrained in an active sense too, right? Think about compulsory education, right? Everyone in America, or children in America, are required to go to school. That means we take away the choice of those children, and we take away the choice of those parents. They don't have the freedom not to get educated. In America, it's a requirement. And in fact, most countries in the world, education is a requirement, right? And that comes right out of the tradition of classical liberalism, which is the idea we should take away some of your freedom because, and in this case, we'll take away your freedom to choose not to be educated, because ultimately it creates a better society for everyone involved, right? So the question for the classical liberal is, what are the principles that we should use to determine when liberty should be constrained and when it should not be, right? There's a balance to be had here, right? You can think about the Bill of Rights in the United States, right? There's lots of constraints the government can do, but there's limits to those constraints. There's limits to those constraints in general, right? So there's a balance to be had, right? A pure sort of tyrannical state would just be total constraint, no liberty at all, right? Liberalism wants to promote liberty, but it also wants to take away some liberty, because sometimes the liberties that you may want to have are actually very dangerous to other people, right? There's sort of related idea here is a principle that John Stuart Mill comes up with called the principle of harm. That's the idea that I'm free to do whatever I want so long as I don't begin to harm others. And as soon as I begin to harm others, the institution should coercively limit my freedom, right? So for instance, if I choose just to not be educated, let's say for instance I have 2 children, as you know, what if I refuse to send to educate those children? I don't want them to learn how to read, I don't want them to get mathematics, and so on and so forth, right? Well, guess what? That freedom ultimately creates harm, social harm. And it's based on that sort of principle of harm that we say, no, we should have compulsory education, right? So whenever we refer to liberalism, we're going to be thinking of liberalism in this sense, right? There's another distinct group here known as libertarians. Libertarianism. Libertarianism is the idea of minimal institutional constraints on liberty, right? That is a minimal state, right? Minimal institutional constraints on liberty. So libertarians, because both liberals and libertarians want freedom. The problem is that liberals think that we should have a little bit more of an active say, and we should constrain liberty in a positive way. The libertarians are much more suspicious of this sort of coercive constraint on liberty. The libertarians think that yes, we should have constraints on liberty. So for instance, you should have the right to kill another person or to steal another person's property, but really the state, the nation state, should really just be concerned with those sorts of core issues of, for instance, state and economy and things of this. I'm sorry, safety, warfare, things of that sort. But for instance, the question of education, that should really probably be left up to individuals, right? We'll see that both liberalism and libertarianism are very much concerned with individualism, right? But they see it, they organize the principle a little bit differently, right? A well-known libertarian here, contemporary libertarian here, would be someone like Ron Paul, right? Finally here, we might say there's also what might be known here as welfare liberalism, right? Let's see here. Oops, pardon me. Welfare liberalism here would be the idea of failing is that not only, right, the classical liberal thinks that individuals, we constrain their freedom, but ultimately it's up to the individuals to do what's necessary. Welfare liberalism is the idea that we have to, not only that, we have to promote equal possibilities, right? That there needs to be minimum equal opportunities among, yes, we'll put citizens here, or individuals, right? And that failing to help those in need does restrict liberty, right? This is the sort of idea that welfare liberalism is the idea that minimum equal opportunities among citizens or individuals need to be promoted. Let's put here, promote minimum equal opportunities among citizens or individuals, and that failing to help those in need does restrict liberty, right? So for instance, think about here about, well, think about when the country in the 19th century, the United States, was a classical liberal country, but there's no social welfare programs. If you're poor, you're just out of luck, right? And you got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, as the politicians love to quote, and become an individual and make a better life for yourself. Well, the problem, though, with that is that a lot of people are born into situations through no fault of their own that automatically constrain their opportunities, right? So, for instance, imagine a child who's born to a mother who's a drug addict, right? And living in poverty, right? Well, the idea here is that those people don't get the minimum equal opportunities, and then if we fail to help those people, right, then we're actually restricting liberty too. So if we want to promote freedom and liberty, we need to address this issue. Now, of course, welfare liberalism leads to what's referred to as a welfare nation state, which I would say the United States has a form of welfare liberalism, though not as much as other nations, right? We do think that, for instance, the debate between I'm trying to think of equal opportunity education, right? And think about the idea that we do think that some people who are born into certain situations, we should give them, we should help them get to college, even though their grade performance may not fully justify it, right? And we do that out of a sort of welfare liberalism. Okay, let me give you another definition here. I guess I could mark these off here for you. Which would be anarchism. Now, and anarchism, of course, comes from the Greek term archos, which means no government, right? Whoops. Right? Pardon me. And for the anarchists, and there's a sort of misconception that anarchist doesn't, we usually think of anarchy as just total mayhem and disaster, right? It's riots in the street, that sort of thing. That's not the idea, right? For the anarchist, they think that people should form institutions, but that those institutions should be non-coercive, right? Is that if you want to call them institutions, can be formulated through the collaboration of free individuals, but that really there shouldn't be a government. And when I say government, there should be no coercive institution, right? And the idea here is, especially, we're going to look at anarchism, the anarchism of Kropotkin later on here, but what we're going to see here is that many of these sorts of early anarchists are very sort of idealistic in their vision of what a nation state, or what technically for the anarchists, there's no nation state, but what a world without a government would look like. They seem to be very positive. So anarchism, well, let me go back up here for a second. So you could say here that if we were going to draw a sort of, you can imagine here as a sort of the horizon of institutional possibilities, right? On the one hand, I would say we could put, welfare, liberal, here would be the power of the state, right? Greater and lesser, right? We might say that, well, the greatest power of the state would be an authoritarian state, which I didn't give you a definition for, but authoritarianism or tyranny, right? Where the total state control, right? But most philosophers are against authoritarianism or definitely against tyranny, right? But we might say, for instance, welfare liberalism is over here, right? Gives more power of the state. When I say power, I mean coercive power. Classical liberalism would be probably sort of in the middle, right? Down closer on this side would be sort of the libertarian, right? And then finally at the far end here would be the anarchist, right? And you can see here that it's sort of, there's a sort of, what do I want to say, a sort of a threshold level here of where these things are. You can sort of see them here in terms of the domain of coercive institutions. Okay? Well, let's go here and let me talk about one more thing, right? You can see here that for us, we've been talking about let me go here, I want to use this. We've been talking about liberalism, right? But which is all of the sorts of forms of government I've been talking about, with the exception of anarchism here, are very individualistic in spirit, right? So on the one hand, we have individualism. And individualism really sees the individual as the focal point of analysis for the political or social philosophy. And by contrast, we can also talk about communitarianism. In the communitarian, right, for the individualist, or for individualism, the idea is that individuals, right, determine themselves. For the communitarian, right, the community, right, or the society constitutes the individual. And the key thing here we're going to be looking at here is Hegel, who's a communitarian. And of course, he then becomes a jumping off point to discuss Marxism. But communitarianism here is the idea that communities constitute the individual or constitute individuals. So that means that instead of looking at the individual as the focal point for whether or not a state is just or not, the communitarian says we have to look at the whole community, because the community is what builds up and creates individuals, right? So, and we'll, as we go through the course of the term and we bump into these terms again, I'll continue to give even more precise definitions of them, right? So there's communitarianism. A sort of extreme form of communitarianism that's very bad would be the notion of fascism, right? And fascism is an extreme form of communitarian that advocates an authoritarian state. So we'll put right, it's an authoritarian communitarianism, right? fascism is. Fascism, when it first sort of, in the early part of the 20th century, fascism wasn't a bad word. Today it is a bad word. And that's because one of the things we found in fascist countries, they sort of, an authoritarian state builds up around, usually between, around a specific sort of national identity, right? For instance, think about Italy, right? There's a sense of who you are if you're Italian, right? And you can think about the history of Italy, and that's where the history of fascism during the Second World War sort of earlier emerges, right? But this is an extreme form of communitarianism because it gives the state total authoritarian control over these communities. And usually there's some communities are the good communities and other communities are marginalized, right? Okay, let's give another one here. Socialism, right? Uh-oh, this is the word that everyone's afraid of, right? What is socialism? Socialism is related to communitarianism, but it's its own sort of brand here. For socialism, equality, right, is the central idea, or let's say ideal, and it justifies, right, the coercive institutions to promote equality. And typically here we could think of, whoops, I misspelled that again. Right, so socialism, the central idea is equality, and the idea here is that equality becomes a principle to justify certain forms of coercive institutions, right? So for instance, you've heard people say, should we redistribute wealth in this country? That is, should we tax the rich more to give to the poor, right? Or to create more social programs for people who are poor, so as to promote a general sense of equality. And that is socialistic in nature. It's not technically a form of socialism necessarily, but it definitely has at its core a sort of socialistic principle, right? And by the way, I should say this here is that socialism is not necessarily undemocratic. Right? Socialism is not necessarily undemocratic. In fact, the most socialistic states that exist today are probably democratic states. For instance, Sweden is a good example, or Finland is another good example of a sort of a democratic socialist form of government. Right? So you can see here that the central unit of concern for individualism is the individual, or is the community. And for socialism, equality becomes the central principle to determine when institutions can be coercive and when they can't be, right? And of course, for socialism, oftentimes, one of the reasons here that people are concerned with is the problem of capitalism, right? Is capitalism anti-socialistic? It tends to be, right? Because winners and losers in the market, right? But for instance, you can see here that a libertarian would be very nervous about socialism because for the libertarian, the individual is the sole unit of concern, not the community or the society at whole, or the state of equality among all equal individuals, right? So you can see here that at the very end of the day, it's clear that politics is about coercion, about, let's say, about the justification of coercion, right? Politics is about the justification of coercion, or in other words, politics is about unfreedom, okay? Now, in terms of what I've discussed in this lecture, you can see here, this last sort of issues, this is discussing the question of what exactly is a society such that we can coercively organize it. Politics is about the principle and justification of the coercive measures. And of course, philosophy is about the reflection in general, about how we ought to organize that society at large. Now, there's a lot of other topics and ideas we're going to be covering throughout the course of the term, but I'm going to end our lecture here because I just want to give you a general sense of what we're going to be doing. We're going to dig down in our next video here, and we're going to be looking at Plato's, the classic political philosopher by the name of Plato, and we're going to be taking a look at excerpts of his Republic and how he believed the state should be coercively organized. Okay, I'm going to end the video here. Thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you guys next time online.